Hey, my name's Joseph Kreps. I'm a DUI defense attorney in Alabama. There was a question that was posed to me last week after the federal government announced through the Justice Department that they would not pursue mandatory minimums any longer on nonviolent drug offenders. The question was posed to me as to whether that would provide any relief for a person charged with driving under the influence. The answer to that question is the mandatory minimum sentences that are imposed most of the time through the federal court system for drug offenders only applies to those charged with certain drug offenses. So the answer to that question is that it will not provide any relief under federal law for anyone charged with driving under the influence. For the most part, unless someone is on federal land, the DUI laws are enforced through the states, through state statutes that have been passed. And there are various ways that someone could be charged with DUI in federal court, but the purpose of this video is to explain the issues related to the mandatory minimum sentences and the relief from that, and not to explain about federal DUIs. I'll do that in a separate video. So the bottom line is the Justice Department is going to back off the mandatory minimum for certain drug offenders and not enforce those. The mandatory minimums are just that, mandatory, unless a drug defendant falls into two certain categories. One is if they provide substantial assistance to the government, which basically means that they work for the government and turn people in. And the other one is basically known as the safety valve, which was passed, I think, back in 1994, that provides some relief from mandatory minimums. In order to qualify for the safety valve, it has to be a low-level, nonviolent offender who's a first-time offender and doesn't use violence or a gun in the commission of their crime. That is certainly a step in the right direction and was back then. And probably roughly 20%, 25% of folks that go through the system qualify for that, but the eligibility requirements and criteria are just so narrow that most folks do not qualify for it. Most of the mandatory minimum sentences were set up for a certain quantity of a drug, whether it's LSD, marijuana, crack cocaine, powder cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, PCP, whatever it might be. They were set up so that if a person possessed or was involved in a criminal enterprise related to those drugs and it concerned a certain amount of the drugs, then they would be subject to a 5-year mandatory minimum without parole or a 10-year mandatory minimum without parole, depending on the amount that they possessed. Now, it's very important that we understand as we go through this the United States Code statutes that are involved here. The mandatory minimum drug sentences are found in 21 U.S.C. section 841. There's also a couple of other items that are necessary to be discussed here. If someone possessed a firearm during the commission of a drug offense, then they will have 5 years added to their sentence. If they are considered to be an armed career criminal and fall under the ACCA, felon in possession of a gun with 3 prior felonies, then they would have 15 years. Continuing criminal enterprise would equal 20 years. So it's important to understand and to know where to go to view those statutes in case that they may apply. The mandatory minimums for use for carrying a firearm is 21 U.S.C. section 924C, and the mandatory minimums for Armed Career Criminal Act is located at section 21 U.S.C. section 924E. So it's very important that we know where to go in order to view these statutes. Now, what was Congress intending whenever they passed these laws? The war on drugs has been going on for quite some time, and essentially Attorney General Eric Holder came out last week and said that one of the things that was not intended through the passage of these laws and through enforcement of the laws was excessive incarceration, which he described as being ineffective and unsustainable. And so it's important to note here that what was occurring and what is occurring is that you have nonviolent first-time drug offenders who are subject to these mandatory minimums, and they are ending up in prison for a long, long time. And the Justice Department and the government have started to notice that that is not the most effective use of resources, and they are offering some relief and not, in other words, lessening the requirements for the mandatory minimums. It's very important to note here that, as I said initially, these are very specific laws that apply mostly to drug cases, unless there's gun involved or a career criminal or a enterprise. So it's important to note here that these do not apply to drunk driving, especially drunk driving in the states, and does not apply to a drunk driving charge in federal court. It's important to note that. There's lots of good resources online that discuss the reasoning behind the cutbacks on the mandatory minimum drug sentences, and I encourage you to take a look at those. I also encourage you to take a look at the website www.famm.org. famm.org. That's a great website that explains the harshness and gives great examples of some of the very harsh sentences that were handed down as part of the mandatory minimums. And there are even discussions on that site and cases that have been reported where the judge goes through a process and talks about how they wish they did not have to sentence someone to a certain sentence that is required as being part of the mandatory minimums, but the judge is required to pursuant to federal law. So it's important to note that, and I encourage you to visit that website and take a look at it. My name's Joseph Kreps. I'm a DUI defense attorney in the state of Alabama. We handle DUI cases throughout the state of Alabama, whether in federal court, whether in state court, or city or municipal court. If you have a DUI pending in Alabama, all you have to do is call us to begin the conversation. You can reach us at 866-348-2889, or you can visit our website, alabama-DUI-attorney.com. That's the symbol dash attorney.com. Thank you very much.